Hi, this video will contain some advice to inexperienced candidates. Okay, advice number one, it's regardless of the job market, whether if it's an employer or a candidate-driven market, there will still always be candidates who will pass job interviews. Good candidates always pass job interviews. Okay, just opportunity might not be as scarce as is an employer-driven market right now. Okay. Second thing would be that it's not in the employer's interest that you over-prepare your job interviews. Okay, it's not only because you'll be able to negotiate a better job offer, but you'll also make a strong first impression to your future coworkers, which are sometimes your interviewers. Okay, now this being said, what about interview prep? What is the best way to prep and eventually then to pass these interviews? Okay, so there's two approaches to prep non-technical interviews. The first approach would be to answer lists of the most commonly asked interview questions. Okay, so you would basically brainstorm or look online for some of these lists, and you will basically do your best to answer as many as possible, like a trivia game if you want, right? This is most efficient to the best possible candidates who consider interviewing as their strength, okay, and who just need a little bit of polishing up before their job interviews. And they might also use those lists in a conjunction with some coaching sessions, right? The second approach to prepare a non-technical interview, and by far the one I recommend to most people, because most people don't consider interviewing as their strength, would be to prepare around behavioral competencies. Okay, so you prepare your stories around interpersonal skills, around decision making, around vision, learning, and so on. Right? So the idea would be to have two components here. To have, on the one hand, you'd have a story bank, and on the other, you'd have to role play that. Right? So this would be the two tools, the only tools you'll need to do well in these interviews. Okay. What do I mean by a story bank? Okay, so a story bank, it's a collection of your best highlights in your career that would touch on those behavioral competencies that I just enumerated. Okay, so there's why would you want to prepare a story bank? Okay, why would you bother preparing a story bank? Well, let me give you three reasons maybe here. You want depth in your interview answers. Okay, so when you brainstorm for stories, you make brain dumps, even of several pages, of some of your best achievements, best highlights in your career, and chances are you're also going to be able to remember, to find out some details you thought would be the most interesting to share. Okay, the second reason you'd want to prepare a story bank would be that you'd have better quality answers, because a story bank entails not only brainstorming for stories, but also revising them at least 3 times. Okay, whereas if you would answer, those lists of questions like a trivia game, you just go as quickly as possible. And if interviewing is not your strength, those answers will become highly scripted and far less interesting than if you would brainstorm them and you would revise those stories. And the third reason why you'd want to seriously consider a story bank is because interviewing is not a one-off for all candidates, fair to say, right? Because you'll have to look at this as a long-term approach, because retention is very poor, especially in high-performing companies. You'd want to switch jobs, and whenever you'd like to switch job, you'd have to have some backup, ideally, and this story bank can represent a great backup, okay, for you. Now, the second tool in your interview prep would be role play. Okay, why is role play important? Well, primarily because you want to see how you deliver in a live setting. To some of you, if you don't want to spend any money, you could even role play in the mirror, even record your answers and see what gives, see where you can improve. This can be highly efficient, if you don't have a budget for these things. Okay, the second reason why you'd want to take roleplay super seriously is to build your listening skills. Okay, listening skills is something most of you will highly underestimate these job interviews. For example, okay, if I'd ask you a question, tell me about the time when you had to make a gut-wrenching prioritization, you would probably know that you would have to talk about a story that would highlight prioritization, which chances are it's going to be also linked to a decision-making process, decision-making in ambiguous situations to core the core behavioral competency here. Now, what happens is if I ask you, how do you prioritize? Okay, which is an open-ended question. Most of you, 90% of candidates, will answer this question as an open-ended, how you would prioritize, your theory around prioritization. Whereas your theory around prioritization going for non-technical PM is probably far less interesting when compared to a story highlighting your ability to prioritize in ambiguous situations, right? So notice how listening skills, understanding, how to prioritize is basically looking for a time when you prioritize, because it's a behavioral interview that they're looking at your past experiences as a predictor of success for your future performance on the job, how your listening skills would help you to give the best possible answer, regardless of how they reframe these questions, right? So this was reason number 2 why roleplay could be highly beneficial, because you'd get these all sorts of variations of these commonly asked questions. And the third reason why roleplay is something you'd want to consider is because you want to see how you deliver under pressure. Okay, so for example, if you hire me as a coach, I could ask you questions you hear for the first time. Okay, so you would see how you would react in these pressure situations, because what happens is some people do block here, and it helps if you practice these things with someone, right? Now, underestimations. Okay, what do people underestimate the most in these job interviews? Okay, the first thing you should keep in mind is that interviewers read you far better than you think. Okay, reading people is their job in most cases, especially for recruiters. And this is a skill that you, if you want to perfection, you'll have to build over the years. Okay, to read people. It's the same thing as building listening skills professionally. If you want to understand what people actually say, that will take, at least it took me years to really become knowledgeable, not necessarily amazingly good with these things. Okay. Second underestimation is time. Okay, the vast majority of candidates underestimate the time it takes to prepare these interviews. So this can be a very significant investment. So that's why, maybe the best approach would be to think long term if you choose to make this investment, right? Another underestimation would be that interview questions are far more predictable than most of you realize. Okay, so even if you go to AI, to ChatGPT to predict your questions, they will predict some of them. It will never be as accurate as, with the professional list, but they're always going to be highly predictable, so to speak. And this was not the case 5 or 10 years ago, right? The dynamic was highly different. Okay, and finally, interviewing slowly yields better results than interviewing quickly. Okay, because the perception here for many of you is that if you interview quickly, you make a strong first impression, you push there, and you will blow them away, so to speak, with your performance. Well, in my experience, interviewing quickly for most of you will rather increase the chances to make some monumental mistakes. And not just monumental mistakes, but if you interview quickly, chances are you will not give your best stories always, right? So if you pause, if you think, if you repeat the question, even if you write down the question in front of them, chances are you're going to be able to find the best possible answer to the question you're getting asked. Okay, and the last section I'd like to share with you here would be overrated advice in job interviews. Okay, and the first one, probably the one, if you'll be following this channel, you'll know I talk about quite a lot, is that AI will not make you land the job, any job. Okay, it's at best an engagement strategy to keep you hooked in your, hopefully, interview prep process, but most people use it differently. Okay, now how do I know this does not work? Well, let me give it 2 convincing reasons here. First is that I coach people who develop these machine learning models and the AI, and coaching these people and see how they prepare the interviews. They never touch the AI that, by the way, they are in the same industry, so they never touch it while preparing their job interviews, okay? And if you want another reason, the second reason is that I have access to thousands of candidates' story banks, and I often can correlate. I often hear feedback from people who pass these interviews, and I can tell you that the number of people who passed these interviews and who used AI on my paid services, it's within the error margin. It's like below 2% of these candidates ever used AI to prepare this job interviews, okay? The next piece of advice here would be star answers, okay? So star answers are great advice if you want to structure your answers, beginning your interview prep and whatnot. Also for beginner, for entry-level roles, they're useful, if you present your answers in a format that your interviewer understands. People prefer familiar approaches, so to speak. But from here to go through to set yourself a challenge, if I'm able to structure my answers in the star format, I pass my interview, there's a very long way to go. Okay, so in my experience, nobody will pay you a ton of money for you being able to structure your answers in the star format, right? So it's a good exercise if you want, but don't expect miracles with the star format, okay? It was invented by the employer, not by the candidate, so to speak. Okay, next overrated advice is on elevator pitch. So back in the day, many even professional interviewers said, hey, the first impression is super important. You might argue, yes, in a telephone screening round, it can be quite significant, but in my experience, the elevator pitch will never, unless you make a monumental mistake in your elevator pitch, it will never, be such a significant element for you to land a job offer, right? So if you prepare your elevator pitch, it's only primarily for screening rounds where, first impressions could be more significant, but for final interview rounds, it makes no difference at all if you over prepare that thing, right? Memorizing answers, it does not work, not even for freshers these days, okay? Overrated advice number 5. The job description contains far fewer gems than you think, okay? Because what happens here, the job description is primarily a marketing manifesto. The employer exhibits their interest, a job ad, so to speak, their interest in attracting the right type of candidate through some marketing practices. How do I know this? Well, I used to run an applicant tracking system with hundreds of thousands of candidates in it, so I know one or two things about job descriptions and these. So I'm not saying you should not read the job description, but there's people literally paying other people to read the job description for them for gems such as key behaviors and whatnot, right? Number 6, selling yourself in job interviews should be done with caution, okay? Because what happens if you bluff too much, especially in your elevator pitch, you will attract attention for the wrong reasons. And for a skill interviewers, becoming skeptical of you from your elevator pitch is the worst possible scenario in a job interview, because they will become skeptical, they will challenge you at every step of the way, and you can imagine how this impairs your ability to perform and to always use your best stories if they become skeptical. So remember what I said in the beginning, they can read you far better than you realize, okay? Because this is their job, to read people. So if you bluff a little bit here and there, that might be fine. You can get away with it. Everyone does it, But if you bluff too much, then that will backfire, right? And finally, the last piece of overrated advice I wanted to bring to your attention is around cheating, okay? So cheating never works in non-technical interviews. In fact, so to speak, it's the same with AI. The number of people whom I worked with and who are cheating in behavioral interviews is within the error margin, even less than 1%, I would even dare to say. People who are able to, do things such as read their answers from their computer screens during these job interviews, because they were so good with this, not because they wanted to, they really needed to. Okay, so remember what I said in the beginning of the video. It's not in the employer's interest that you prepare these interviews too well. right? The rather you go on the cheating side of things, on the preparing your answers, rewarding them using AI, and thinking about what's the best way I could cheat in the job interview, rather than preparing strongly for that job interview, not just to land a job offer, but again also make a strong impression to your future coworkers in the job that I hope you're gonna get. So I hope you found these tips useful, and thank you very much for watching.